Hello guys, welcome back to Unite Pieces channel. On this occasion, we will discuss a film titled Luther the Violent. This film tells the story of a detective with extraordinary abilities in handling all of his cases. However, his reputation comes to an end, and he ends up in prison after investigating a murder case organized by a psychopath. Without further ado, let's get into the plot. The film begins by showing a man named Callum who receives a call from someone. During the call, Callum is threatened by the caller. If Callum refuses to meet him within 15 minutes, the caller will release Callum's private video to the public. Reluctantly, Callum complies with the demand. While on his way, Callum stops his car after seeing someone lying unconscious in the middle of the road. He then reports the incident to the police. However, shortly after, the unconscious person suddenly gets up and immediately incapacitates Callum. The next day, a police chief detective named John Luther arrives at the crime scene. Strangely, Callum is nowhere to be found at the location. Because of this, Luther approaches Callum's mother, Karen, who has also come to the scene. Worried about her son's safety, Karen pleads with Luther to find Callum as soon as possible. On the other hand, a man named David Robey is seen talking about Luther. It turns out that David tells his associate that he must stop Luther from searching for Callum, who was actually kidnapped by David himself. Before ending the call, David instructs his associate to gather all background information on Luther. It doesn't take long before Luther's dark past is exposed to the media, leading crowd. At the same time, David was very pleased because his plan had succeeded. Luther's imprisonment was certainly welcomed by the other inmates, as they now had a chance to take revenge on him for having put them in prison before. While Luther was taking a shower, he was suddenly attacked by the inmates there. Meanwhile, Karen looked surprised after receiving a call from Callum, who asked him to pick him up. In a hurry, Karen immediately went to the location Callum had given, a luxurious white house, which was Callum's last known location. Hearing the phone ringing, Karen followed the sound of the ringtone to find his son. Moments later, several people arrived at the same location and began to follow Karen. Outside the house, David, wearing a mask, watched with satisfaction as the people inside suffered. The next day, a detective named Odette Rain, who replaced Luther, was contacted by his superior and instructed to go to the scene of last night's incident. Meanwhile, Luther, who was in prison, watched the news about Callum's death along with several others who were burned to death inside a luxurious house. The police investigation revealed that the house belonged to an Arab man and had been unoccupied for the past 5 years, and most of the victims found were people who had been missing for several years. That was when Rin instructed her team to find the main perpetrator behind the series of murders. On the other hand, Luther was also trying to figure out who the cruel perpetrator could be. Then, he received a letter from someone. Inside was just a single sheet of paper with the number 65.8 written on it, which turned out to be a radio frequency that Luther needed to tune into. On the radio broadcast, Luther heard a man screaming in pain. As he listened to the voice of the perpetrator, who turned out to be none other than David, Luther was shocked, realizing that David had tortured his victims before killing them. That was when Luther realized that his imprisonment had been orchestrated by the perpetrator. Before the broadcast ended, a prison guard approached Luther and told him that someone wanted to see him. The person who came to visit was Karen. Luther was shocked to see him, and they talked about the death of Karen's son. Karen expressed deep disappointment in Luther for failing to keep his promise. After meeting with Luther, Karen returned to his car. Then, Luther contacted Ryan, the officer who had taken over his position, using a phone he had hidden under his mattress. During the call, Luther explained that the mastermind behind Callum's murder had sent him a message. He also added that the case seemed far from over, as the suspect had also sent messages to the victims' families. Luther was convinced that the perpetrator had an audience for his actions. Before Luther could finish speaking, Ryan cut him off and told him to stay out of the case. "You can't help me, John." Then, Luther contacted his colleague to ask for help. Unfortunately, before Luther could finish speaking, several police officers entered his cell. The next day, Luther asked his colleague to allow, or even provoke, the other inmates to attack him. He did this in hopes that the prison authorities would transfer him to another facility, giving him a chance to escape. In the afternoon, in the CCTV monitoring room, a prison guard noticed an inmate attempting to hang himself. The guard immediately rushed to stop him. But unexpectedly, it turned out to be a trap. The act was staged so the inmate could unlock the cells and free the other prisoners, instantly causing chaos throughout the prison. Inside his cell, Luther was attacked by other inmates who had previously received orders from the guards. As a result of this incident, which went according to Luther's plan, he was transferred to another prison. However, during the transfer, the vehicle transporting him was suddenly ambushed by a group of people who immediately freed him. It turned out they were all Luther's allies who wanted to help him. In a different location, David was seen visiting his wife, who was being treated in a hospital. There, David showed her a recording of an interview with a man who had lost his daughter. After watching the recording, David's wife looked disappointed in him because he kept carrying out his actions. Some time later, Luther was taken to his group's hideout. It was there that he was given a car he could use to track down the perpetrator. At the same time, Rye received information that Luther had successfully escaped. 6 hours later, Rain visited his former superior, Martin Crawley. The purpose of Rain's visit was to ask Martin to help him find Luther, since Martin was one of Luther's closest friends. During the conversation, Rye explained that it was highly likely Luther intended to continue his investigation into Callum's death. Meanwhile, Luther is currently investigating a location based on the signal frequency provided by his associate, the same frequency that previously broadcasted the torture recording over the radio. On the other hand, Martin is searching Luther's prison cell and discovers the torture recording that Luther had previously heard through the letter he received. Understanding Luther's next move, Martin immediately orders the police to track the signal frequency. At that moment, Luther asked the man to explain why he had broadcast the victim's recorded voices. It turned out that the man was merely a victim of David, who had forced him to comply with his demands, to air the recordings, by threatening to release an explicit video of him with another man. Since the man didn't know the perpetrator's true intentions, Luther asked him to hand over the phone that the perpetrator used to contact him. Fortunately, before the police stormed the location, Luther managed to escape. The next day, David contacted his partner to ask about their progress. It turned out that David and his partner had been holding many young women and men hostage, whom they planned to execute. As Luther had suspected, the two of them regularly broadcast the victims' executions on the dark web through a website they created. By doing so, they were able to earn a large amount of money, and their next show was about to be broadcast soon. In addition, several computer experts hired by David had sabotaged important individuals in his region. This was done to force them to pay David through the dark website he had created, while watching the torture he carried out. Some time later, Luther was seen in the middle of the city, making a call to Martin. During the call, Luther asked Martin to trace the number of the perpetrator who had previously contacted the phone he was holding. After the call, Martin instructed Rye to trace the number provided by Luther. That way, they could not only catch the perpetrator but also arrest Luther, who was still a wanted fugitive. Not long after, Luther called Martin again and requested the perpetrator's location, which turned out to be near where Luther was currently located. Unbeknownst to Luther, the police had already been dispatched to that location. Meanwhile, several people were seen standing on top of a building, preparing to end their lives while being recorded and broadcasted online. This was all part of David's plan to stream the event on the dark web. After a long search, Luther finally managed to locate David through the phone call he had made. However, the situation grew increasingly chaotic as David managed to take a man hostage. Shortly afterward, when the police successfully surrounded them and the bell rang, several of the individuals on the rooftop jumped, ending their lives. David used that moment of chaos to escape from Luther and the police. Determined not to lose him, Luther continued the chase, which led to a physical confrontation between the two inside a train tunnel. Their fight was eventually interrupted by a police officer who managed to locate them. Unfortunately, the officer was injured by David, who then quickly fled the scene. Worried about the injured officer's condition, Luther tried to help him. However, as more police officers began to arrive, Luther was forced to leave the officer behind and continue pursuing David. Shortly after, David contacted one of Rain's associates named Arch World War, who had previously been assigned to uncover dirt on Luther. It was clear that Arch was being forced to comply with David's demands because David threatened to expose Arch's private video. After that, David contacted his associate, Arkady Kasimov, to ask about their progress. As he would be a bit late this time, he had someone to pick up. At the same time, Luther entered an abandoned house to tend to his wounds. He then contacted Martin and Rye to ask about the condition of the injured police officer. After learning that the officer had died, Luther explained that the perpetrator's motive was money, and that he first blackmailed the victims in order to control them. Shortly after, Rain, worried about his child named Anya, immediately called her. During the call, Rye apologized for not being able to take her to school later and told Anya to order an online taxi instead. After the call ended, Anya felt thirsty and went to the kitchen to get clean water from the tap. Then, Anya heard someone calling her name. The next day, Karin was at home when Luther came to talk to him. Luther asked if there was anything Callum had hidden before his death, as he believed Callum had been threatened to meet the perpetrator prior to dying. Luther was also convinced that the perpetrator would appear in Karin's life after Callum's death. Hearing Luther's explanation, Karen, who understood that Luther was referring to David, said that David wouldn't be that cruel. Nevertheless, Luther insisted that Karen explain who David really was. On the other hand, Martin managed to prove that Luther's suspicions during the investigation were correct. Not long after, while Rain was investigating who David really was, he suddenly received a call from David, who had taken Anya hostage. In the call, David demanded that Rai kill Luther. If Rai refused to comply, David would not hesitate to harm Anya. Not wanting his child to be hurt, Rai contacted Luther and asked to meet. At a bar, Rai explained in detail who David was. He revealed that the burns on David's wife's body were caused by David himself, as David could not accept that his wife intended to divorce him. Seeing that the situation was untenable, Rain urged Luther to leave. However, because his daughter was threatened, Rain now intended to bring Luther before David. Fortunately, Luther told Rai that David always broke his promises and warned him not to trust David. In the end, Rai agreed to cooperate with Luther to capture David. Before that, the two of them visited David's wife, named George Jett, intending to gather more information about David. At the same time, Archie and his associate managed to access David's website, which was about to broadcast a torture preview where donors could choose the victims and the methods by which they would be executed. Before heading to David's location, Luther contacted Martin and asked for his help. Meanwhile, on the other side, Archie received information that Rai was now going to approach David. He immediately contacted David while preparing to leave. David, knowing that his wife was the one who had leaked his whereabouts, asked Archie to kill her immediately. If Archie succeeded, David promised he would no longer bother him. Reluctantly, Archie secretly went to kill Georges. Fortunately, as Luther had anticipated, Martin and the police managed to catch Archie in the act. Cornered and desperate, Archie then decided to end his own life. Back to Luther and Rai, after a very long journey, the two of them finally arrived at the location given by Georges. There, Luther and Rai found several human corpses deliberately placed by David in a pool of ice. When they reached a large house, they found Anya, who had died hanging just like David's previous victims. Rain, deeply saddened by the death of his daughter, blamed Luther and told him to leave immediately. Taking the initiative, Luther then searched room after room in the place. Not long after, Rain realized that the body hanging there was not Anya's. Meanwhile, Luther, who was alone, encountered David, who immediately attacked him. Some time later, Luther regained consciousness to find himself tied up, with dozens of cameras in front of him. It was clear that David was now broadcasting live on his website. The difference this time was that Rai was forced to torture Luther. If he didn't, they would kill Anya. Reluctantly, Rai obeyed David's orders and stabbed Luther. After that, in a surprising turn, instead of freeing Anya, David now demanded that Luther hit Rai with a hammer. Unable to bring himself to do it, Luther was forced to abandon the idea. As they kept threatening Anya, Luther, in a burst of anger, immediately attacked David and his men. While Luther was chasing David, Rain hurried to rescue Anya. Since the room was locked and gasoline had been poured all over it, Rai and Anya had to fight hard against Arkady in order to escape from the place. Following Luther's earlier report, Martin and the police were now heading to their current location. Fortunately, before David could escape in his car, Luther managed to catch up with him. Although the car David was driving plunged into the water, Luther was able to stop the spread of gasoline first by using David's remote control device. Shortly after, Luther, who was on the brink of death, was rescued by the rescue team. In the end, after all his struggles and sacrifices, Luther managed to break the chain of murders down to its root, even though he had to be sent back to prison. Some time later, Luther regained consciousness and was shocked to find himself in a government safe house. Not long after, he was approached by a group of people, and it turned out to be the head of intelligence, who wanted to have a private conversation with him. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, don't forget to press like and leave a comment.